Hey everybody, Braden here bringing you a cheap opinion in politics, and today we will finally talk about how bears can save money too, and not just forest fires. Uh, Last week, it came announced to me that Congress was working on raising the debt ceiling. And what that is, the debt ceiling is put in place of what the U.S. government can borrow up to. And we were on the verge of hitting it. And so a deal was struck between the Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, and Speaker Pelosi to essentially raise the debt ceiling until June of 2021. Now, this pissed off a lot, and of course, it made it through the House, and then also it passed the Senate just yesterday. And there were a lot of Republicans that voted against it, but it still had the overall support of sending it to the president's desk. Now, one thing that really came about was that there were a number of conservatives going around saying that this is the death of the Tea Party. This is the death of fiscal conservatives. And this whole point of this video is me arguing against that idea. That, part of this is essentially Trump, when he signs this is it. This is the death of the Tea Party. Now, why are they going around and saying that? Well, within this agreement, the heart of the Tea Party, what they had done as far as trying to rein in government spending, was setting these spending caps back in the early 2010s, particularly in 2011, that never materialized, that Congress would continually push back year after year after year. And so some see it as an axe. You can look at my other video and get my further comments on my opinion of the plan, who it's good for, and who's at the cost of it. But going back to my main point, why there's a bunch of damn bears on the screen that you're looking at right now. The first bear is very important. Above me is a campaign ad run by President Ronald Reagan in 1984, the famous Bear in the Woods ad. And what that is essentially in reference to the Cold War. I'll leave it at that. But I figured, let's have a couple of things to stare at, other than me discussing why I disagree with this premise that Donald Trump has essentially killed the Tea Party, or has killed fiscal conservatism. So, these deficits that President Trump will be running, I think starting next year, he'll be looking at his first $1 trillion deficit. Now, we haven't run a $1 trillion deficit since President Obama. When President Obama came into office, when the economy was doing bad, he had several years of $1 trillion deficits. I think it reached as high as $1.4 trillion. And by the time President Obama left office, the deficit had gone down to, I want to say, roughly $600 billion. So roughly, he was able to cut the deficit in half. Now, I mentioned earlier the Tea Party. Well, the Tea Party had come about in 2010, in 2011, and really made a fuss about it. And so they instituted these caps that put $55 billion on defense spending and $55 billion on domestic programs. So education, transportation, things of that sort. $110 billion total that, as I've said before, never materialized because Congress, time and time again, would suspend the caps. So the last couple of years that were left of those caps didn't really matter to begin with. If Congress is really never going to abide by those guidelines anyways. So let's back up, and we'll go back to the Bush administration. Now, this is the early 2000s. The Bush administration is going to run some pretty large deficits, not trillion-dollar deficits, obviously. They're not in. He's not having to deal with that financial crisis, but he did have large deficits as well, and I'm speaking, of course, of President George W. Bush, who was a Republican, and when President George W. Bush came into office, we're just going to go with the general terms that most people are familiar with. I'm not going to get too specific of it, but essentially when he came into office, there was the budget surplus that the President Clinton administration had run in the last several years of his presidency. And so that was part of the big question of, well, what are we going to do with this surplus? And you had the then Vice President Al Gore going, man, bear, pig, going around wanting to put it in a lockbox, and thus the term stuck. And President Bush decided, let's go ahead and let's crank into neoism, go full neocon. You also had a good old vice president of his by the name of Dick Cheney that famously said, deficits don't matter. Of course, I don't think that's the most famous economic quote said within that administration. I will give that to President Bush when he so famously said, in order to save the free market, you have to break free market principles. Well, I'm not a genius, I'm no economist, but it seems to me in that statement it really is no longer the free market then. But regardless of the point, those don't really sound very fiscal conservative ideas to me. That doesn't sound, where's the Tea Party? Where are the fiscal conservatives during President Bush? But if we go back and a little bit further, we go back into the 1990s. The Republicans will win in 1994, what we call a wave election in politics. And in that wave election, they essentially ran on this contract with America. It was 10 things that Speaker Newt Gingrich, by the way, don't praise him too much, just throwing that out there. But Speaker Newt Gingrich came into power. It was the Republicans' first time to essentially capture the House in a very long time. And Bill Clinton would be dealing with a Republican Congress. And within that, they were concerned about the deficit and getting that under control. And thus is where it's going to lead us into these budgetary surpluses. So, going back and looking at these four presidents, you've had President Clinton, Democrat, President Bush, Republican, President Obama, Democrat, and President Trump, Republican. These are really the two instances I've given you as far as there being some fiscal conservatism about, and that being at the heart of it, of reining in government spending because the deficit/debt is out of control, has really only come up in really these two instances that Republicans really raised, which is in the early 2010s and in the the mid 1990s. So my overall point is that both of those times were with Democrat presidents. Oh no. Could these fiscal conservatives be fake and only doing the idea of fiscal responsibility politically, and that's about it? Because they damn well know that the American public would like a government that lives within its means just as the American people have to? Ooh, I don't know. It's hard to say. But where were the fiscal conservatives when around for President Bush? Where were they for President Trump? President Trump's already, this last go around, I think this past year, ran about 870 something, or somewhere around there. Like we'll round it up, $900 billion deficit. These are very large deficits that someone will have to, kind of bear it. But the overall point that some conservatives were making, that Donald Trump has essentially killed fiscal conservatism, the death of the Tea Party, I disagree with this statement because, in my personal opinion, again, this whole thing has kind of been my personal opinion, but in my personal opinion, how can you kill something that never really was a thing to begin with? Now, I'm not talking about everyday fiscal conservatives in the Republican Party. I'm talking about members of Congress, the legislators. They have never, for the most part, ever been fiscally conservative. Of course, if you don't want to take my word for it, that's fine. You can essentially, as of right now, fiscal conservatives will remain in hibernation until the next president gets a D by their name. And that, my friends, is the reality of the world.